Sure.
but I'll go ahead and let Jake take it away. Thank you again.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
And with that, we'll go ahead and we'll move on to our final presentation of the day, freeze drying and potential food safety challenges. Dr. Grace Donao from University of Nebraska-Lincoln. That looks
Yes,
like
thank
you're
you. Yes, can everybody hear me fine?
perfect. Yes.
All right, I'll try to share my screen. Okay. All right, can everybody see my screen now?
Yep, looks good.
All right. Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to join this afternoon. I know I sit between you and the end of the day for day one of your conference. My name is Grace, and I'm a research associate professor in the Department of Food Science and Technology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I'm also affiliated with the Food Processing Center. I didn't start off doing freeze drying. Actually, a lot of my work is in high pressure processing. But because I am in Nebraska and there's a lot of raw pet food production that happens in this state, I kind of got roped in to freeze drying. And more importantly, I guess when I first started looking into freeze drying, it was kind of at the start of the current highly pathogenic avian influenza virus, where we also saw some decrease in egg production and egg prices kind of started rising. And then I saw some articles on NPR and online about people starting to make freeze dried eggs at home and trying to sell them at outrageous prices. So I kind of thought, well, this is a really interesting dynamic. Very interesting that their freeze drying equipment has gone down in pricing already, that it can be done at home because that's a fairly new phenomenon. And then also people are being super creative with it, which I think overall is good as a food scientist or food engineer. I like when people are interested in how to make foods and all the innovation and creative ideas that they have. But then there's definitely a dearth of information, especially when it comes to food safety with regards to freeze drying out there, because most people focus just on the quality of the freeze dried food items. So this is an opportunity for us to kind of have some discussion and for me to share at least what I know and what my lab group has experienced when we've done some studies. My presentation, if you want to kind of follow along in your device, you can certainly scan this QR code here. I also have a website that you can kind of, if that's easier for you to do on your own computer. I've also provided a copy of my slides to the organizers of the conference, so that's probably something that they can distribute afterwards. So without further ado, because I know we're towards the end of the day, let's get started. So, why freeze dry? I think some of the biggest drivers of this trend that we're seeing right now are the first one, equipment cost has really gone down for as little as $2,500, which, you can get a fancy oven for that. Some refrigerators, home refrigerators may cost just as much. So for anybody who is a foodie, somebody who wants to maybe enter and do like a cottage food production at home, anybody who is a food entrepreneur may actually want to, just try out freeze drying and come up with a new format for a very traditional product. By offering it in a new format, it might be something that kind of just allows them to engage with a whole new set of consumers. So I think equipment cost is one that's kind of driving why people want to freeze dry. It's something that they can do, and not very many people can make them. In terms of food texture and flavors, when you think about it, once you remove the moisture from any kind of food product, you are concentrating everything else that is in that food product. So if it was supposed to be spicy, it's gonna become super spicy. So there's lots of interest with like freeze-dried peppers. Certainly, you can kind of make your own spice mix that way, which can kind of be pretty interesting. If it's meant to be sour, you can get something that is super sour. And then, as we've seen with interest in freeze-dried candy, so anything that is meant to be sweet or let's say lemony in flavor or like a strawberry, it's really, really going to have that intense strawberry or lemon flavor. In terms of texture, because freeze-dried products tend to be very porous, That's where the ice crystals used to sit. And then now all of a sudden, when we've sublimated those ice crystals into gaseous steam, they leave behind a lot of air pockets. And so it's kind of interesting then to have, let's say, a gummy bear that's supposed to be all squishy before, now being presented to you in a very intense gummy bear flavor, but then it's also super crunchy. And so then that can kind of play different things in your mind, maybe not quite like the mushrooms we heard about earlier, but it's just something fun and something kind of different. And then finally, as more and more people want to preserve foods at home, but then they also demand minimally processed foods, maybe this is something that freeze drying offers for them, because freeze drying is meant to be a more gentle process than, let's say, heating foods at high temperatures, where some of the vitamins, minerals, some of the color pigments are destroyed because they are heat sensitive. So with freeze drying, you're able to kind of preserve a more natural state, a raw-like attributes of that particular product, because you're not using any kind of high heat during the preservation process. So in terms of a definition, I think a lot of the best practices when it comes to freeze drying are actually in the pharmaceutical journals. So think about making vaccines or us preserving bacteria for research. They would use a process called lyophilization, which is the same as freeze drying. That just happens to be the term that they use. But for me, in terms of food science, the one that's in the second bullet here, which is in red font color, is kind of the definition that I really like because I think it's complete. So the first thing is it is a stabilizing process. So the product that comes out of a freeze drying method or process is going to be stable, meaning shelf stable. It's not going to have enough water activity in it to support the growth of microorganisms or any other chemical reactions that could further deteriorate the quality of the food product. So it's a stabilizing process in which the food is first frozen. So that's the first term in the word freeze. That's where it comes from. And then after that, you start reducing water. So that's the drying portion. But even the drying portion can be split up into two processes. So first you do it by sublimation, which is the change of solid ice crystals direct into the gaseous steam, bypassing the whole liquid phase. So typically we think of, if I have ice, I have to melt it into liquid water, then I have to heat it up and then get it into the gaseous steam for it to leave my food product. But in this particular case, we go from solid ice, bypass the liquid portion, and then go straight to the gaseous steam. But then, as you know, for those of you who have a background in food science, there is a little bit of water that does remain in a food item, and it's usually really tightly bound to the structure of the food material. And this is especially true if you have a food product that is what we call hygroscopic. So if it has high sugar levels in it, it's going to try to hold on to just a little bit of water. And so then you can drive that water away by desorption. So desorption would be done at a higher temperature than what you would need for sublimation. So that's something that we can look at the temperature profiles that happens in a freeze dryer and kind of understand when desorption may occur and start. But as I already mentioned, the final goal or the goal is to have a final water activity that no longer supports microbial growth and then also other degradative chemical reactions. But by and large, because we have to do the process under vacuum, this is a batch process. So how much product you can make is really going to be determined by the size of the freeze dryer that you're working with. And so depending on how big the business becomes, or if it's something that's just for a hobby, your throughput or your efficiency at freeze drying may be limited by the size of your equipment. So other reasons why people might want to freeze dry besides what I already mentioned earlier, certainly the biggest thing is we want to preserve a biological activity of a heat sensitive compound in a food item. So think about some vitamins, enzymes that we don't want to lose. Maybe it's the color, the bright color that we would associate with a fresh fruit. Maybe something that is heat sensitive. So we don't want to necessarily heat it up to preserve it, but we can certainly freeze dry the item. We then can also use freeze drying to extend the shelf life of food products by removing the moisture. So you end up having, like I said earlier, a shelf stable product that doesn't require refrigeration. And then finally, to make foods more portable or easier to transport. So I know in the hiking, camping communities, there's lots of people that want to freeze dry different kinds of food items, especially ready to eat meals. Simply because then, as they're traveling, they don't have to carry all that excess weight because water is very heavy. And then what they'll do is when they reach the end point or a midpoint of a resting point in their journey, then that's when they can certainly rehydrate the food item, heat it up so that it becomes more palatable, and then they can have that meal that they're craving. So I like this diagram a lot, mostly because it shows kind of like what all of us may remember from our middle school or even high school chemistry when we were first introduced to the phase diagram of water. And just by looking at the phase diagram of water, we can actually plot out what is happening in a freeze dryer. So I've kind of annotated this by putting some pictures of fresh strawberries kind of right in the middle of the graph where it says start. So typically, if you were to, let's say, make freeze-dried strawberries, you would slice them very thinly. That increases the surface area from which all this water that we want to remove is going to escape from. If it's such a big solid item, it's going to take forever to freeze-dry that product. So most of freeze-dried items that you see are going to be sliced fairly thinly. So we start off there, and as a fresh strawberry, all the water that is in that strawberry is going to be at liquid condition or liquid phase. On the y-axis we have pressure, on the x-axis we have temperature. So looking at perhaps strawberries at room temperature and at 1 atmosphere or 760 millimeters of mercury, that's where we get started. So the first step is to freeze it. So even without changing pressure, you can certainly freeze your product in your home freezer. And that's usually pretty good because you want to go ahead and get it to a frozen state prior to loading a freeze dryer. It minimizes that extra step that you have to do in a freeze dryer. And then once you've loaded into the freeze dryer, your frozen product, then you can pull a vacuum. So that's the downward arrow that you see, and that's what we call our vacuum freeze. So at that point of the process, we are really making sure, converting that all of the water that is in our food item remains in solid form or solid phase. And we're going to try to get as close to zero vacuum pressure. Then eventually, I mean, if you don't heat anything, it could stay there forever and you're not really changing anything to the water that is in the food item. So in a freeze dryer, all your products typically are loaded onto trays. They sit on shelves and those shelves are heated up. So you have to apply a little bit of heat to help with the sublimation. So now we're looking at the first left arrow from point B going to the right. And as soon as we cross the triple point of the product, we're a little bit more assured that more and more water is being sublimated. Now, at some point, you do reach a temperature where if you wanted to, you can just stop right there, release the vacuum pressure, and then you'll go right back up very close to the starting point. But if you want to get down to a very low water activity, typically for freeze drying, it's about 0.1 to 0.2 is kind of like what you'll get at the end in terms of water activity. If you stop just right at sublimation or the end of sublimation, and if it's a well-designed freeze drying process, you should be able to remove 90% of the moisture just on the sublimation step. Typically, what you might happen is you have a water activity between 0.3 and 0.4. So certainly by then you would have a stable product. But a lot of the home freeze dryers that are affordable actually go through or are pre-programmed to go through a desorption process. It's a little bit exaggerated on my graph here. It doesn't really go above 100 degrees C. Typically, you stop somewhere around 60 to 80 degrees C for desorption. So you warm it up enough so that you can try to remove as much moisture from that product to achieve a 0.1 to 0.2 water activity. And then you release the vacuum. Hopefully by then you've actually really removed almost all the moisture from the product, or at least over 90% of the moisture from the product, so that any remaining water will not necessarily be, you don't have enough water really remaining for you to have a little bit of liquid water trapped inside the freeze dried item. So that's sort of like how it works, or how you can plot out your freeze drying process on a just a generic phase diagram of water. I'm not sure if how many people in the room have seen or been in close contact with one of these home freeze dryers, but this is a typical one that everybody purchases. Harvest Right is probably, I think they probably own 80 to 90% of the home freeze drying market. They offer these units at various kind of different price points. There's another company out of Idaho called Blue Alpine. Their equipment is very similar to Harvest Right. I was told that Blue Alpine maybe gives the user a little bit more flexibility, like they can actually program the unit, whereas Harvest Right really tries to make it easy for the user so that it's already pre-programmed. They have some kind of a feedback loop program already built into it so that the user does not have to do anything but just push a button. So in any case, like, different parts of it. So you'll have a door that usually has some kind of a rubber gasket on the outside. So it makes that perfect seal when you start pulling the vacuum. That inside kind of cylinder is what we call the chamber. On the top right is that graphical touchscreen or graphical user interface. Then you have the shelves with the heating pads and underneath each of the shelves. So if you are getting close to one or you're close to one, look on the underside, and that's where you'll see how those shelves are actually heated. And then those shelves are where you put your trays full of product. The other integral part of the freeze dryer would be a vacuum pump. So I guess the really inexpensive units or the most basic units will have an oil-based vacuum pump. The oil is required to replace that oil probably every once in a while, depending on how you use it. You'll notice a drop of whether or not your unit can still hold vacuum pressure. If it doesn't hold vacuum pressure as well, there's probably time to change the oil, because sometimes what happens is moisture can leak into the vacuum pump and then it doesn't work as well. So there's some notice on the manual on when to change and how to change the oil out of your vacuum pump. If you want to spend a little bit more, usually it adds a cost of $4,000 to the unit. You can certainly invest in an oil-free vacuum pump, so then it's a lot less to maintain. But then at that point, the cost of the whole freeze dryer really does magnify. So a lot of folks may not necessarily invest in an oil-free pump. What's not shown in my diagram or my slide here is the back of the unit. So if I look at the back of the unit, you'll notice there's a port, and then there's like a little valve where you can kind of turn it shut. You can fully open it and fully close it, or maybe kind of set it somewhere in between. So that valve is used to release the vacuum. So once you pull a vacuum in this chamber, you're not going to be able to open that door until you release the vacuum. That particular valve or pipeline is also where you'll drain water from the unit. And so we'll talk about where does all this water come from. And then towards the upper right next to the on button, there is a USB port to download the data. So at least for Harvest Right, they haven't really provided a lot of instructions on how to download the data and how to read it, because I think usually they just really want it to be super duper easy for the user. I do think that if you're going to use the equipment as part of your business, and if you want to have some record of how each batch has been freeze dried, then it'll be good to kind of at least download that data, graph it, and then see if you are still consistently freeze drying your product from one batch to the other. I'm not sure about the Blue Alpine equipment because I don't have one, but I do believe they also have a mechanism for you to download the data. That data plots the pressure over time. It plots shelf temperatures over time. It also tells you how often the heating pads come on and off. So if they're heating up or not, and stuff. So you can get a couple of good pieces of information about how efficient your product is, or your process is. But what it doesn't tell you is it doesn't tell you anything at all about your product. So there are no temperature probes or moisture probes, anything like that to kind of keep track of what's happening to your product. So a lot of the data when it comes to your product, if you're, it depends on the cottage law in your state. So in the state of Nebraska, depending on the food item, they are required to note before freeze drying and after freeze drying pH, before and after freeze drying water activity. So a lot of the testing just happens to be before and after. And nothing, you can't really, it's hard to really monitor the process while it's going. Okay. So I've already mentioned this. So this is what Harvest Right does, makes it easy for the consumer. It's a little bit of a shame. Again, I'm speaking as an engineer. I want to know exactly how it works. So then it's kind of treated, a lot of folks treat their freeze dryers like a magic box. It's a black box. I put something in. The next day, I take it out and voila, I have a really nice, fun food item. So I wish they kind of go through a little bit more of the science and how it actually works and how you can kind of monitor your process and monitor how consistent you are at making your particular food item. So this is what makes the magic, I guess, behind this, what Harvest Right calls their smart technology. So they have a couple of sensors inside of the freeze dryer, something to monitor whether or not you're under vacuum conditions. So that's your pressure sensor, but then also a couple of thermocouples that keep track of the temperatures of the shelves. So in this feedback loop, what happens is the heating pads are turned on. So it starts to warm up the shelves. And as the shelves warm up, it encourages more and more sublimation. However, the unit has a condenser, and that condenser can only hold so much. It can only convert gaseous steam to ice that lines the inside surface of the freeze dryer, but it only has a certain capacity, right? So this is also why, like when you size a freeze dryer, they usually talk about how much moisture, how much wet product can it process in one cycle. So for example, I have a medium-sized Harvest Right in my lab, and it's rated for 10 pounds of wet material. If I were to load it with 20 pounds of wet material, I'm never going to be able to really achieve a completely dried water activity of 0.1 to 0.2 freeze-dried product because the condenser is not able to handle that. So in this particular case, as you are sublimating the moisture, the condenser is working hard to convert it into ice that lines the inside surface of the chamber. And while it's trying to do that, if it's not able to keep up by how fast you are pushing the moisture out of the product, you're going to start losing vacuum pressure. Because where's that water going to sit? It has to sit in the atmosphere. Well, under vacuum, you're not supposed to have atmosphere. So then what happens is those shelves have to cool down. So the heating pads need to turn off until all that moisture is removed from the atmosphere, converted into ice. And then once again, you're able to achieve vacuum conditions inside the chamber. So that part is the downward swing or portion of the feedback loop that I've drawn in this slide. So that just kind of cycles back and forth for usually in my system, it's like I said, it's rated for 10 pounds of wet material. Depending on the food item, it can easily take 12 hours to freeze dry a product. Some products might take longer, like a full 24 hours. And then at that point, you can also certainly help freeze dry the items. So maybe what I have to do for some products is I have to slice them even more thinly so that I have a lot of surface area, not a whole lot of volume of product to actually dry at any given batch or any given time. So in my diagram here, I kind of exaggerated things. So the shelves are heating up and they're glowing red. However, in real life, you don't see that glow because most of the time you're just trying to heat up the shelves, maybe all the way up to 60 degrees C, no more than what do you call this 80 degrees C, and 60 degrees C is kind of like a really warm egg incubator. So it's not even close to, let's say, I guess, well, boiling water for sure. We're not even reaching those types of temperatures. Okay, so then at the end of the day, when you get to the desorption process, in order to reduce and remove that bound water from the food item, you might get a 1 to 2% moisture content change. But doing that, even getting to the 1 to 2% moisture change or a decrease by that amount might still take you several hours. So really there's this kind of mathematics that you have to do that at some point is the product stable enough, because my process might actually not be overly practical. It's too long for me to drive out the last 5%, 1 to 2% moisture, 5% moisture, when really I could have been done a little bit earlier. But then it's really hard to tell in a freeze dryer, in a closed system like this where you can't touch the product. Like, how do you know when things are done? So I get this question a lot. How done is done? One of the first things we have to know is that the products tend to dry from the outside to within. So when you put a batch of product into a freeze dryer and you pull it out, because the system itself tells you that we cannot detect any more moisture inside of the freeze dryer, so we think it's done. So you release the vacuum, you pull out your trays, and this happens to be a project that one of my students did. We kind of had some silicone ice cube trays that made little ice cubes. We didn't fill them up, so they still kind of look a little bit more rectangular and not a perfect cube. But these are raw eggs that have been scrambled or put through a blender. And then we made these little rectangular pieces, froze them, and then loaded them into our trays. And I'll show you later what they really look like. But what it did was it almost pixelated my tray so that I can kind of assign a kind of like an Excel sheet, little cells, column A, row 1. Because I also know that in freeze drying, the edges tend to dry first and then the centers tend to dry last. So I also kind of wanted to see if that was true in my small unit. It definitely is true in a much larger commercial unit, that you can have varying degrees of quote unquote doneness within a freeze dryer. So when these come out, the little egg rectangle or squares, if you will, did look like the little yellow styrofoams. We were doing multiple runs of these, and then all of a sudden we had a batch that we were expecting to be done in 12 hours, but the whole unit stopped at 7 hours. We're still not really sure why it stopped at 7 hours. When we pulled the samples out, they did look dry, but then the student decided to do a knife test, which is really take a couple of samples, cut it in half with a knife, and then look at the cross section. And as you can see on the right-hand side, we did have some samples that were still wet on the inside, even though looking at it from the outside, it looked like it was sufficiently dry. So that's the first thing that I usually tell people is always do a knife test. And preferably, you have to collect enough samples from the inside trays and then in the middle of those trays, because that would be the last samples that would completely dry out. Things that are on the edges of your trays will likely dry first. And depending on the food item, they might dry, a few hours earlier than what is actually in the middle of the tray. Another one, and by the way, my slides are pretty wordy because I don't have an extension publication on this yet. And so when I give people my slides, I assume you may refer back to them and you kind of use them as a guide. So we won't necessarily read every single bullet item here. But this is another method that you could do. It's not perfect because what we really want at the end of the day is water activity. But water activity meters can be pretty pricey. But a lot of folks have kitchen scales at home. So one of the things that they can do also is before they freeze dry, actually weigh a tray, an empty tray, so they know what the tare weight would be. Then they can load their product and then get measurement, a weight measurement for both wet product plus tray. And you do it for every tray that you're going to put into the freeze dryer. Then you load it, you let one full cycle of freeze drying happen. When you're done, you release the vacuum, pull out your sample. Don't touch your products yet, your dried products. And what you'll do is you'll weigh both the dried products on the trays and then subtract the weight of the tray. So now you have kind of like an initial weight of the dry materials. Now, every freeze dryer has this option where it asks you, do you want extra drying time? And for the harvest right units, the default is 2 more hours of the desorption step. So what you can do, because the desorption step does not necessarily need to be done under vacuum conditions. So what you can do is you can load all the trays back into the freeze dryer with your quote unquote dry product, close it up, and then yes, tell it, yes, I want 2 more hours of drying time. Come back after 2 hours, pull it open, reweigh your trays. And what you'll notice is if it wasn't sufficiently dry, you'll still see a decrease in weight, meaning there was still some moisture that could be pushed out of your product. And you keep doing that until you no longer have a change in those weight measurements. So it's not ideal because it's not even really telling you what the moisture content is, but it's a way for you to see how long or how many cycles of this extra drying time do I really need to kind of try to remove all the water from my food item. But then after that, really, I always tell folks in Nebraska if they contact me that, for a nominal fee, I think it's about $50. We'll actually double check 3 things: the pH of your dried product, the water activity, and then also the moisture content of your food item. Just kind of give you an idea of what it is. But it's just something that, for cottage food producers to also work with their flagship universities, food science departments, to see if they can get help in figuring out the water activity of their finished goods. And then try to be consistent in making subsequent batches in their freeze dryer. So water activity is really what we want. As I mentioned earlier, anything below a 0.6 activity tells us that we won't have that microbial growth anymore. Really, I think ideally, you want to hit at least 0.4 final water activity. That's actually a pretty good spot because you also have typically lower rates of lipid oxidation. But most freeze drying operations end up with water activity values below 0.2, typically as close to 0.1. And if you do things properly, the difficulty there is you have a greater likelihood for food to go rancid. And that's just typical in food science. When water activity is that low, what degrades the product, especially if it has any fat in it, would be that it'll go rancid. And that is especially true for freeze-dried items because there used to be ice crystals, right? So those ice crystals form like little circles or little crystals in the food item. Once it sublimates, it leaves behind those circular pockets. So it's very porous. And those pores just mean increased surface area to the food item. Before, oxygen in the air can only interact with the outside surface of your product. Now that you've freeze dried it and made it porous, all that oxygen can now go all the way inside through the food product. So most freeze-dried pet foods actually have a lot of antioxidants in their product formulation. So this is something that, I guess for folks who want to do a high fat food item and freeze dry it. And what I can really think of is like people that are trying to do, like, let's say, a ready to eat meal where perhaps it's like a spaghetti with meatballs. Then those meatballs will have some fat in it. Certainly, eggs will have some fat in it. So, those kinds of things you have to think about. Okay, well, how are you going to mitigate lipid oxidation down the road once the item is dried? A lot of that would be how well you package the product as well. So your packaging material, having something that has good moisture and oxygen barrier properties. Also, perhaps something that blocks light from coming through the product, like a Mylar bag, is something that's going to be really helpful at mitigating lipid oxidation. I know some folks also use some oxygen absorbers. So any little bit of oxygen that might get trapped, because when you package your product, the pouch is open, so you just can't help it. And then you have no way of maybe flushing the package with nitrogen gas before you fully seal it. So flushing with the nitrogen gas or other inert gases may help push any remaining air or dead air that was in that package, so that you could mitigate or at least not expose your product over a long period of time within a sealed package to oxygen. So, other kind of things to note: why would freeze-dried foods go rancid faster? Besides creating a lot of holes and pockets, when we freeze dry something, we're going to concentrate. So let's look at mozzarella cheese. Before freeze drying, it might have a moisture of 53.4%, fat 20%, protein 20%. After freeze drying, when you remove the moisture, by concentration, you've lowered moisture down to 4.3%, but both fat and protein practically doubled in terms of percentage. So by concentrating that fat, it's going to be just a lot more susceptible to becoming more rancid. I've already talked about this. Freeze drying would leave behind those little pores, so it allows oxygen to not only interact with the outside surface of your food item, but actually penetrate through the product. So just in some information about oxygen absorbers. I guess it was last summer. I kept getting this question: should freeze-dried foods be packaged with oxygen absorbers? I say yes, because again, it's a food item that's more likely to get oxidized. And then I get the question of, can I reuse these oxygen absorbers, or are they just single-use items? If they are single-use items, and in fact, if you open it up, you'll see kind of like a rusty iron type material. So what it does to scavenge or to use up any remaining oxygen inside a package or the environment, that iron interacts with oxygen to form iron oxide. So when you open it up, it looks like it's all rusty. That means that material is all spent. The other thing that I would say too is make sure that when you purchase these oxygen absorbers, that you're purchasing something that is for a food grade application. It's just something to kind of double check. I know a lot of folks that are freeze drying at home are mostly purchasing their supplies from Amazon. So just double check what is the intended use or application of that oxygen absorber, and ensure that it is for a food item, so that you're not unnecessarily introducing something chemical or anything else in close contact with your food product. Going back to the mozzarella example I had earlier, does freeze drying change the nutritional value of the food? Yes, it becomes more dense, right? Nutrient dense. And this is really interesting because I always tell people it's maybe somewhat dangerous or just a little bit concerning, because there's a lot of freeze-dried snacks and treats that are being made. So when you freeze dry something, perhaps if you're eating an apple, you might only eat one apple in a decent size, small apple that's one serving. But then when you're snacking on these, because they're super sweet and they're very addictive, you kind of run into the danger of eating more than what a typical serving of fruit might be if you're eating a freeze-dried fruit item. Even more so, maybe if you're doing some kind of like a candy. So just be very careful about portion sizes, serving sizes when it comes to these types of items because you're concentrating all that nutrients. So you may actually have to lower the serving size by weight or by pieces just because it's not the same as eating the fresh wetted version. This is a good one. I get this question a lot. How long is the shelf life of freeze-dried items? Number one, it depends on how well it's been packaged. So I think best packages out there really would be something where you can hermetically seal the package. So certainly you can use mason jars. You know, it has excellent moisture barrier properties. Your oxygen or outside air is not going to be able to get through that glass and metal lid. The problem is it still allows light to go through. So in my lab, we've actually, just as an example, had some cut carrot sticks and we freeze dry them and they looked really great, excellent snacks. But then we packaged them in a mylar bag where one side of the bag was mylar material, but then on the other side it was plastic. And the reason for the plastic is because, you know, as consumers, we want to see what's actually inside the mylar bag. And then we sealed it, put an oxygen absorber in it, and then sealed it. I was pretty surprised that after a year, because we just forgotten the bags of carrot sticks, it was like really brown. So carotene is very susceptible to light degradation. So that carotene orangey color was gone after a year. So it's not true that all freeze-dried items last 25 years. And so the next point I was going to make on this is that 25-year mark. I get a lot of questions. And I think the most interesting one that was presented to me was one of the inspectors from the state of Michigan was kind of going back and forth with someone that was making freeze-dried, ready-to-eat meals. So they had a pretty good process. You know, they had a kill step because the material was being frozen. But then they were freeze drying it, packaging it up. And, you know, the guy had a good HACCP plan, everything. He was meeting the right temperature, time controls for safety. But then he really wanted to put a 25-year shelf life on the package. And so the inspector from Michigan contacted me. And there really are no studies out there whether or not freeze-dried items can last 25 years. The closest data we have, or at least the ones that I can find, are a series of studies done by a professor in BYU, and he has already retired. So this is back in the early 2010s, or even early 2000s. Within the Mormon faith, you know, they're encouraged to kind of store food for long periods of time. The idea would be for them to use it and replenish whatever they're storing and stuff. But then inevitably, some people just forget, you know, oh, I have cans of beans or cans of whatever in my basement. And I guess at some point I have to get rid of it. So they ask people within their church communities to send items older than 20 years that have been stored in basements, garages, etc., to BYU. And it was really interesting because there were some things that were, you know, not freeze dried, but just spray dried or dried, you know, flour, eggs, egg powders. And what they found was a lot of these food items kind of lost their functionality. You know, you could get 20-year-old flour that had been stored for over 20 years and try to make bread out of it. And they didn't get a whole lot of rice. There was no more gluten functionality in that flour as well. Would it bake and kind of make decent bread? So a lot of their sensory analysis results were, you know, if you had no choice, it is palatable. You could eat it, but it would not be your first choice. So you know, kind of just in conversation with the Michigan inspector, we kind of decided that no, we really, you know, in the absence of data, we don't want people to put a 25-year shelf life date on their home freeze-dried items. And then number two, when you think about it, even MREs made for the military that are ultra processed, quote unquote, they do have an expiration date. Even like raw pet foods or pet foods that are freeze dried usually have an expiration date. And those companies that I work with, they'll tell you they're good for 3 years if it's in a really, really nice package and everything. You flush all the oxygen out. But even they are only willing to put like an 18-month shelf life to 24-month shelf life on their item. But as soon as it's opened, all bets are off. It's going to degrade in quality pretty fast and must be used quickly. This is just a slide that I have. It has, I guess, a comparison between freeze-dried mangoes versus dehydrated mangoes and what are some of the differences. I think things to kind of make a note here would be you can definitely achieve a lower water activity with freeze drying compared to a food dehydrator. Maximum temperatures that may be used in a freeze dryer, 120 F, will still be lower than what you would normally use in a food dehydrator. And then the biggest difference really is the texture. You tend to have crunchier food items come out of a freeze dryer, whereas in a food dehydrator, they tend to be like leathery and very chewy. So I also encourage some folks who usually contact me, if their goal is food preservation, have they considered just doing a food dehydrator because it still achieves a lot of, I think, what they want out of the food item without necessarily having that high capital investment on the equipment. Do all freeze-dried foods need to be rehydrated? Not necessarily. Depends on what the intended use is at the end. A lot of freeze-dried items could actually be, let's say you're making spice mixes or you're pulverizing eggs because you want to use it later. So those ingredients may need to be rehydrated if you're going to use it in your cooking and stuff. But maybe they don't have to. You may just have to adjust the amount of moisture in your cooking process so that those ingredients are actually fully rehydrated and such. But if you're making snacks, most snacks and treats tend to be eaten when they are still dehydrated. But certainly if you're making a meal, a ready-to-eat meal, well then yes, those would typically be rehydrated. And I would also add that they need to be reheated so that they're more palatable for consumption. But it really depends on what it is that you're trying to do. So a couple of misconceptions I hear is freeze drying kills any bacteria that's present. That's not true. It's actually a really good preservation method. So this is what I meant earlier where we pixelated or tried to create pixels within each of our trays in our freeze dryer. After freeze drying, those eggs actually had an average moisture content of 0.52%, so really low, and an average water activity of 0.04. So they were pretty much like little styrofoam pieces. But the reductions, so the student that I had a couple of pieces that were, what do you call this, inoculated with generic E. coli, Enterococcus faecium, and Listeria innocua. And as you can see, the reductions we were getting were below 1.6 or 1.7. E. faecium is definitely very hardy and very resistant. So we we didn't really get any reduction in that. The graph here is the type of data that you can get at the back of the unit. So the black line represents pressure, the red line is shelf temperature. And for whatever reason, Harvest Right has a thermocouple that just sticks out in the middle, and it's called ambient temperature. So what's the typical temperature inside of the freeze dryer during the entire process? And as you can see, that one gets no more greater than 80 degrees F, but the shelf temperature can go all the way up to 120 F. And that is their standard protocol. My unit is programmable, so I purchased a scientific model. So then another kind of misconception is, well, what if at some point I just spike the temperature above 165 so that I could kill salmonella? And here, what we found was if you do it towards the end, And that's really the only place where you can spike up the temperature. The material is so dry, it doesn't have enough moisture in it to conduct the heat from the tray all the way through the product. So the material is not actually going to heat up all the way to 120 F. And that's shown in the reductions. We did get a bump, right? Like ephasium, we can now reduce by zero point 0.3. Generic E. coli 1.75, L. inocua 1.75, but these are still not something that I would consider like true kill steps. So you could use perhaps freeze drying as part of a multi-hurdle approach, but I would necessarily not call it lethality. But in 2026, a lot of the commercial equipment manufacturers like Cut and Freeze Dry, Parker Freeze Dry, and TechSource, so they make commercial units, have told me that all of them are doing some validation studies and that they would release some data that they can get a 5 log kill in a freeze dryer. So watch out in 2026. We might have some of that information coming out. I surely will be vetting how they did those studies because I'm still a bit skeptical. My group has done some microbial challenge studies in commercial units for pet food companies, and we've never seen reductions that high. So that would be pretty interesting. So these are what the commercial units look like, and they do operate very differently than a home freeze dryer because every single thing here you have to program every single step of the process. So they're not, so you have to have some background information about how you're doing your freeze drying process. So scale up usually for some folks from a home business up to something commercial would have that scale up challenge. But sometimes their co-manufacturers or equipment manufacturers can help them figure out how to do that and such. Then the one last thing that I want to mention is raw meat that is freeze dried does not necessarily need to be handled the same way as fresh meat, especially when it's rehydrated. So there's a lot of folks that want to do freeze dried raw meat and store it under shelf stable or room temperature conditions. And I guess, if you have a water activity that low and it's packaged properly, you try your best not to cross contaminate during packaging, then yes, I would say that very similar to how the raw pet food industry works, you can store that at room temperature. However, the moment you rehydrate that product, don't think that your rehydrated freeze-dried meat is something that's going to be stable. It is now going to be another TCS food, so you have to handle it just as you would any fresh meat once things are rehydrated. So my next couple slides, I won't necessarily read, something for you guys to consider reading and maybe part of suggestions for if you're being asked questions about best practices for food safety and freeze drying. Some of these are pretty common sense. So you practice safe food handling at all times, right? As you normally would, even in a cottage food type business. Try to test for product doneness visually using the knife test, and then also definitely using a water activity meter. Try to work with your university extension to kind of get that information. Package dried foods immediately. So coming out of a freeze dryer, they're going to be super, what I call hygroscopic. They're going to want moisture because there's just so much surface that could interact with the humidity that is in the air in the room that you're packaging. So try to do that as quickly as possible to mitigate reintroducing moisture within your sealed packages. So oxygen absorbers are good to use with high fat foods, especially to kind of combat or mitigate rancidity. And certainly treat rehydrated freeze-dried items as time temperature control for food safety foods because now you've reintroduced moisture into the food product. Yep. Clean and sanitize your freeze dryer after each use. So that's also just something you would do in any other process at home. And then finally, I have these additional resources on my last slide. There's a couple of universities that have already pushed out some extension papers regarding freeze drying. The University of Georgia, I've collaborated with them and also putting out their materials. And then one of these days, I'll get the University of Nebraska extension listed here because I'll be putting together some of these presentation materials I have into extension guides. So with that, I mean, I think we still have maybe 4 to 5 minutes left for questions, and I'd entertain those questions.
Thank you so much, Grace. That was awesome. We do have quite a few questions, so I don't know if we'll get to all of them,
Sure.
but the most popular one right now is that, are there any food items that should not be freeze-dried?
Absolutely. So, freeze drying is really intended to remove moisture. So, like food items like peanut butter or chocolate, like things that are already fairly low water activity or low moisture, also certainly something that is high fat, are things that a lot of food science textbooks tell you to not even bother freeze drying. So those are, and we don't see many of that out there in the marketplace because they fail during freeze drying.
Yep, that makes sense. Thank you. All right, the next one. Is beef jerky on the softer side completely dry? How is drying done but still so tender and soft?
Ooh, so I don't know if you can actually get still tender and soft beef jerky with freeze drying because it's going to try to remove all that moisture that's in there, and you typically associate freeze dried items with something that is rigid and porous and crunchy.
Mhm.
So probably on the tender and soft, leathery, chewy side, you're more likely to go the route of using a food dehydrator.
Cool. And I know you touched on that. Thank you for reiterating.
Oh, no problem.
All right. So the next one. Do you trust that a home-based business would correctly freeze dry products to the point that they wouldn't need it, would that they wouldn't need it to be tested for water activity, pertaining to like those meals that we are talking about?
Yeah, I personally wouldn't. And the reason is okay, and I tried this, and we're gonna try again so that we can get more consistent information. I took like a canned noodle soup, chicken noodle soup, and I also took another can. It was kind of like it had beef, it had some beans, but it wasn't a chili. So there was, I think there may have been some cut potatoes in it, and then a little bit of sauce. So it probably was some kind of a beef stew. When you have multiple components, each one of those will have different structures. And so they also freeze dry at different rates. And depending on the size of the chunks of meat, let's say that you have, especially for those meals, it's quite possible that, let's say, the sauce part gets fully dehydrated, the noodles get fully dehydrated, but then when you get to like the vegetables, like a whole bean has skin on it, it probably will not, that skin will prevent any moisture from really escaping that bean. And then like a big chunk of meat, if it's not cut thinly, it's probably not going to sufficiently dry by the same time that the noodles and the sauce would. So the first words in the question, do you trust? Nope. But maybe it is possible to do, but they would have to do a lot of, figuring out the right sizes and all that stuff. I do know some folks that are doing meals, freeze-dried meals. In industry, commercially, what they would do is they would freeze dry every single component separately. And then by weight, they would weigh out each component so that every time you have a little packet of soup that, needs to be rehydrated is really the same amount as what is in the other one. So, in a home business, especially in cottage foods where maybe labeling and consistency from one package to the next may not necessarily be as required, it's pretty tough.
Well, that was my question, so I really appreciate it. Awesome. And we'll move on to the next one. So, what is the safety concern for raw meat, eggs, and steak? Is this okay?
So for raw meats like eggs and steak, just remember that however clean the product was coming in will be just as clean as it when it comes out of the freeze drying process. So if you already had salmonella in those eggs or E. coli, let's say in a raw steak, then it's a good thing to kind of just assume that while you're preserving the food item, you're also preserving all that bacteria that was in there.
I see that you're preserving. Okay. The next one. I have a 15-year-old MRE in my garage that I'm saving for a special occasion.
Great, because I have a pack of freeze-dried pet food that it's in the back of my bookshelf that I'm saving for a special occasion. Maybe when I retire, I'll open it
Close to a hospital, you know.
up.
How do these emergency food kits get away with putting an up to 25-year statement?
I honestly don't know. And I wonder if the words up to 25 years is kind of like a little bit of covering their butts and stuff, because there's really hardly any information out there that says that these items really last that long.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the next one. Will the foods trip from the freeze dryer to the package significantly promote either lipid oxidation or hygroscopic absorption that interferes with longevity?
Yeah, I think it depends. I know some folks are doing really well with, like, if they're freeze drying, let's say in an environment where they keep it clean, they have good temperature control in that environment and humidity control in that environment. So I'm kind of thinking, inside your home, you have the air being what do you call this? So you have central air conditioning that kind of tempers the room, right? And you don't have high humidity. I think I worry a little bit because I know in some states you could have a cottage food business in a dwelling that's, kind of attached to your home. So let's say a garage or a shed. So in those particular cases, especially let's say in the middle of the summer where it could be hot and humid, then yeah, that environment may not be conducive for packaging food items just based on temperature and humidity and everything. You might keep it clean, but yeah.
Gotcha. Oh, all right, we're good there. Does freeze drying achieve the same result as cold smoking?
I'm not sure about this one. I think it will come down to like the what do you call this? The final water activity, because for freeze drying, it tends to be really, really low. And then the texture is very different than cold smoking or cold smoked items. So I think that would be the biggest difference. But in terms of, maybe coming up with something stable, a freeze dried item could be stored without refrigeration, whereas I'm not sure if a lot of the cold smoke products can also be stored for a similar amount of time without refrigeration. So it depends probably on the food item as well.
I agree. All right, Mark has answered. What are the primary pathogens of concern for home use?
I think it's just the same as in a commercial setting, right? Like I know the other day I did the same talk for Iowans in their food safety task force. And what they're seeing is a lot of people doing hydroponic microgreens and trying to freeze dry them. And so, when you think about, okay, well, what could potentially enter the hydroponic system? Or even when you buy greens at the grocery store, the quality of that food item, however good or bad it is, it starts off, that's the highest quality before freeze drying. So if those items are already contaminated by the time you brought it to your home, or let's say, the other thing about home freeze drying too is you don't ever want to mix raw and cooked items within the same freeze drying cycle because things aerosolize, I guess, right? So you could get some of those pathogens also becoming part of the sublimated moisture inside, so you can cross-contaminate within. So I would say the primary pathogens are the same. You could certainly have a listeria, salmonella, E. coli situation also with freeze-dried items, regardless of where they were freeze-dried at home or in a commercial setting.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's going to be all we have time for. Thank you so
Okay.
much. And all the other questions that weren't answered, I'll go ahead and send your way, and hopefully we can get an email out to everybody with those unanswered questions. But thank you so much for your time, Grace. You did incredible.
No problem. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'd be happy to just respond to those questions through you. I'll put them in an email, and then you can distribute to the group.
That would be great. Thank you, Grace.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your presentation. And we want to give a special thanks to all of our amazing speakers today. Join us tomorrow for day 2 of the conference. It's going to start at 8:30, just like today did. And we have another full day of really great, really interesting topics. That's it. Thank you guys for showing up, and we'll see you tomorrow.